Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel Study with Apsara. So today we'll be doing a lesson Portrait of a Lady. The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Before we move on to lesson, make sure to like, share and subscribe. Also share your thoughts in the comment section. So let's move on. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the past 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of a person who would have a wife or a children. He looked as if he could have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. This seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, as we treated it like the fables of the prophet she used to tell us. Here, the author is talking about his grandmother, and the author had known her for past 20 years and she had always been old and wrinkled. He was told that she was once young and pretty and he had a husband. His grandfather's portrait was hung on the wall, which he wore loose fitted clothes, a turban and a long white colored beard that reached his chest. He also appeared very old, and the author thought that he was someone who could have many grandchildren but not a wife or children. The author could never imagine that once his grandmother was young and pretty. He could not connect to this idea. She used to tell him and his cousins about her childhood memories, like the games she used to play as a child. They found these stories illogical and disrespectful because it was beyond their imagination to think that grandmother was once a child and played such games. They thought that her life stories were like the moral stories which she used to tell them. So that is the first paragraph. Now moving on. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain that she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same stage for 20 years. She could have never been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in the spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance a stoop, and the other one telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over the pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountain, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. My grandfather and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in the monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice and never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen inkpot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me after a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and a sugar spread on it. We went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. Here, the author is telling that his grandmother was short, fat, slight bent in posture, and her face had lot of wrinkles. She seemed so old and she had been same for the past 20 years. According to the author, she was beautiful but not pretty. His grandmother was short, fat, slightly bent in posture, and her face had lot of wrinkles. She seemed so old and she had been the same for the past 20 years. According to the author, she was beautiful but not pretty. She walked around the house in an awkward way, wearing spotless white clothes, beads of the rosary hanging from one hand. The other hand rested on her back for support. She had silver colored hair which was not neatly combed and it was disorganized. She was constantly chanting prayers. He compares her to the winter landscape in the mountain which was peaceful and calm feel. She was a live example of pure white peace emitting dignity. And the author lived with her in the village and they were good friends. His parents left him with her to settle in the city. Author's grandmother used to wake him up every morning and get him ready for school. She would recite her morning prayer and while she bathed and dressed him up and loved her voice, but not try to memorize a word what she spoke. She would make things ready like a wooden slate, a tiny earthen inkpot, and a red pen. He would eat a thick stale chapati with a butter and a sugar spread on it. They both used to walk to school, and his grandmother carried stale chapatis with her to feed the village dogs. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our homes, growling and fighting with each other for chapatis we threw to them. My parents were comfortably settled in the city. They sent for us. This that was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the street, and she took to the feeding sparrow in the courtyard of of our house, of our city house. His grandmother, so here the author is saying his grandmother would accompany him to the school as the temple was attached to the school, and she used to visit the temple daily on the side. On one side, he would sit on the veranda with other children. He would sing the alphabet and the prayers in the chorus. On the other hand, she would sit in the temple and read the scriptures. After finishing, they would walk back home together. And the village dogs met him at the village door. They would follow them to the home, growling, fighting with each other for the stale chapatis that she fed them. When the parents got settled in the city, they called them. That was the turning point of his friendship with his grandmother. They shared same room, but she would no longer give him company to his school. He started going to an English medium school, and a motor bus would come to pick him and drop him up. There were no dogs in the street whom she could feed as she did in the village. So she started feeding sparrows in the veranda of her house. Now moving on, as the as the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time, she continued to wake me up and get ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little thing of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. This made her unhappy. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the sculptures. One day I announced that we were given music lesson. She was very disturbed. To her, music she had lurid association. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars, and not meant for gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me after that. So here, as the years passed in the city, the interaction reduced. And for some time, she continued to wake him up and would get him ready to school. She would ask him what he had learned in the school that day. The scientific terminology and English words made her unhappy. She didn't know the language. She could not help him with the lessons. As his new school teacher never taught him about God, religious sculptures, this made her sad. She did not approve of such education. She came to know that he was getting his music lessons, and it disturbed her. According to her, music was indecent and it was art for the beggars and not for the ones belonging to decent families. She didn't like that he learned music, so she stopped talking to him. Moving on to the next paragraph. When I went to the university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel, spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon, she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. She sat in the veranda, breaking the bread into little bits. Hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirpings. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some even sat on her head and smiled, but never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. As the author went to university, he got a room of his own, common link of friendship with his grandmother that they had when they shared the same room. It was changed now, and thus friendship ended with her. She became more private and spent her whole day spinning wheels. From sunrise to sunset, she would sit silently and recite her prayers. In the afternoon, she used to feed sparrows in the veranda. Breaking the bread into small pieces, she would feed hundreds of birds. The birds would gather around her. Some sat near her, some sat on her legs, some on her shoulder, and a few on her head. She never shooed them away but always smiled. She was happiest in half an hour during the whole day. Moving on to the next paragraph. When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure that my grandmother would be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and her age no one could tell, but my grandmother could. She was not even sentimental. She came to leave me at the railway station and did not talk or show my emotion. Her lips moved in prayers, and her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of her rosary. Silently, she kissed my forehead, and when I left, I cherished the most imprint as perhaps the last sign of physical contact between us. But that was not so. After years, I came back home and was met by her at the station. She did not look a day older. She still had no time for words. And while she clasped me in her arms, I could hear her reciting her prayers. Even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with the sparrows whom she fed longer and with frivolous rebukes. When the author decided to go abroad for further studies, he believed that it would be the last time he would see her, and he would be gone for 5 years long. As they all reached at the station, she held him tightly and kissed his forehead. She he thought that it was the last physical contact with her. The wet impression of her was dear to him. She was not sentimental at all. When he came back after 5 years, she came to meet him at the station. She looked just the way she did 5 years ago, not a day older. She held him again in the arms and was still reciting her prayers. He noticed on the first day of his arrival that not only the sparrows would make her happy. He noticed on the first day of arrival that only the sparrows would make her happy. Moving on to the next paragraph. In the evening, a change came over her. She did not pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, started to sing. For several hours, she thumped the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum and sang of the homecoming warriors. We had to persuade her to stop about overstraining. That was the first time I had known her that she did not pray. The next morning she was taken ill. It was mild fever, and the doctor told us that it would go. But my grandmother thought differently. She told us that her end was near. She said that since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life, she had omitted to pray. She was not going to waste any more time talking to us. We protested, but she ignored our protest and lay peacefully in the bed praying and telling her beads. Even before we could suspect, her lips stopped moving, and the rosary fell from her lifeless finger. Peace pallor spread on her face, and we knew she was dead. So here she didn't follow her regular routine, so she collected a few women from the neighborhood and got a drum and started singing with them. She thumped and the ruined part of the drum and sang along. The whole family persuaded her to stop as she might get ill due to exhaustion. The next morning she fell ill. It was a mild fever. The doctor told them that it would go away, but she took it differently. According to her, she would die soon and the end was near. She started chanting prayer as she didn't want to waste the last hours talking to anyone. And the family protested and tried to stop her, but she lay peacefully on bed, chanting prayers and doing her beats. Suddenly she stopped and the rosary fell from her lifeless finger. Calm, pale appearance spread on her face and she was dead. We lifted her off the bed and, as it is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with a red shroud. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangement for her funeral. In the evening, we went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be ceremoniated. The sun was settling and had lit her room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. We stopped halfway in the courtyard. All over the veranda and in her room, right up to her where she lay dead, wrapped in the red shrouds of thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. There was no chirping. We felt sorry for the birds. And my mother fetched some bread for them. She broke into little crumbs, the way my grandmother used to, and threw it to them. The sparrow took no notice of the bread. When we carried my grandmother's corpse off, they flew away quietly. Next morning, sweepers swept the bread crumbs into the dustbin. Last part of the lesson, family lifted her from the bed and laid her on the ground and wrapped her with a red colored cloth. Thousands of sparrows sat silently near her, and the author's mother fetched some bread for the bird, and they didn't eat any. So they flew away later. They flew away later as family carried the dead body. The sweeper removed the crumbs the next morning. Birds were so sensitive they did not want to eat any bread and but were mourning the death of the one who had fed them for many days. The lesson has come to an end, and in this lesson, the portrait of the lady is a story of the author and relation between his grandmother over the years. He explains her appearance, which helps to create the image in the reader's mind. Thank you.